Good afternoon. Welcome to another Straight Up Hangout. My name is Ben Friesick from Barrel Strength Design and the Sprout plugin suite. Today I have with me Andrew Welch from NY Studio 107, who's going to be sharing with us his Disqus plugin, and Selvin Ortiz, Disqus plugin, and Selvin Ortiz from selvin.co. All right.
That's
Andrew,
the cute naming. It's not my naming on it. It's the Disqus service.
Disqus. It makes sense.
The cute is in there to make it unique.
We struggle on the web because we say these words to ourselves all the time before we actually meet people that say them to us out loud. So,
like attribute and attribute, right?
Yes, exactly.
Char and car and care.
The list goes on. All right. For those of you watching this, if you're interested in asking questions, in the Craft Slack, we have a back channel. So pound back channel. You can add yourself to that. Brandon Kelly was going to join us today, but due to serious wind issues and a loss of power, he's not going to be able to make it. And he did say he would be in the back channel if anybody wants to be posting questions there as we go through that. We'll be monitoring it as well as we move along. So Andrew, you have your Disqus plugin, the version 2 and version 3. Would you like to give us a general overview of what it does?
Yeah, sure. So Disqus is a commenting system. And it's just a nice way to handle internet comments. And, internet comments are kind of the STD of the internet world. They're just horrible to deal with in general. Just in terms of, spam and the horrible things people write and all that fun stuff. So Disqus is a service that allows you to use it to manage the comments. And you'll see a lot of big news agencies use it. I use it on my blog, and it's kind of handy. In order to make it work, you just need a little bit of JavaScript in your templates. The reason for the plugin is that it will handle things like the single sign-on for you, which is really useful. Let's say you've got a community and people need an account on your craft site to be able to comment. Well, whenever they're logged in, they're able to comment using Disqus via the single sign-on feature of it. And then you don't have to worry about forcing them to log in via Twitter or sign up with a Disqus account or anything like that. So really the reason for the plugin existing is primarily to enable that single sign-on, but it also makes it just really convenient to add it to your templates.
Great. And this, if you're interested in Craft 3 plugin development, we've been doing a few of these Craft 3 plugin reviews the last few weeks. We've tried to be kind of increasing the complexity of what concepts we're dealing with. We started with a simple widget, we moved on to a field type, and here we're going to start getting into controllers and variables and some of those other constructs in the system.
Right.
So,
yeah, I think the reason why we picked this plugin to have a look at is it's relatively simple, but it does show a couple of things that people might be interested in terms of it will render a front-end template for you. It handles the settings, which are now different as of beta 8, I think, of Craft 3. Handles variables and, just a couple other minor things, but it's a relatively digestible in terms of what it does. Is pretty simple, and we can look at the differences between Craft 2 and Craft 3.
Great. Shall we dive into the code?
Let's dive in. Let me get my screen sharing going here. And boom. Okay, so what we have here is on the left is the Craft 2 plugin, and on the right is the Craft 3 equivalent. And I'll just go through a couple of things quickly, and Ben and Selvin, please interject if you have something to add or questions or things that I'm not explaining well that people might want to hear. So what I'm looking at here is the plugin, the base plugin class for the Craft 2 one on the left and then the Craft 3 one on the right. The biggest thing that you'll notice right off the bat is the Craft 2 plugin has all of these functions for things like the description, the URL, all that kind of stuff. None of that is in the Craft 2 plugin. and that has been broken out into the Composer.json. So all of the same info that you would normally put in code here, you put in the Composer.json. Everything up here is all just standard Composer.json stuff. The extra key has an array of stuff that's specific to Craft, like the handle, the schema version, whether it's got CP settings, all that kind of good stuff is in there. And one of the reasons they made the change is, first of all, they're focusing on Composer more with Craft 3. I mean, that's how you're able to install plugins, and under the hood, it's going to be using that to install plugins from the plugin store. And the other reason is because all of this information is now just in a JSON file, they don't have to actually execute any code from your plugin to read it. Whereas if you see over here, well, they actually have to instantiate this class before they're able to even tell you the name or the description of it or that kind of thing. So let's get down to where we actually do something. You want to talk about the settings first, maybe?
Can I interject very quickly?
Yeah, do it.
At some point, you were able to define these methods here, or I guess the equivalent of defining the 2.0 functions or methods in that class. You mentioned that in the extra attributes in the JSON file is the recommended way to do it.
Yep.
But you should also be able to set them as properties in the plugin class if you wanted to.
Sure.
And the reason for that would be for, I guess, if you have a lot of properties, you would get visibility in your editor or IDE. You'll actually get completion or that kind of stuff. If you don't add them as properties in the plugin class and choose to define them in Composer instead, it's always a good idea to define at property doc block definitions in the plugin class.
Yeah.
Is that still the case though? I don't know if beta 9 changed that, but I think for the most part, anything that you would put inside of extra, you should be able to define as properties in your plugin class with very few exceptions.
Yeah, I don't know the answer to that. I don't know if they have changed that or removed that from beta 9. I have no idea.
Okay.
But given that they're trying to do this from the perspective of not having to execute any code, I don't know. I mean, it might be something that will go away. I really don't know.
Sure.
But I do what you describe, and we're kind of getting the cart ahead of the horse here. But yeah, I mean, what I do is in the doc block, I just put those hints in there so that the editor will know what these things are.
Yeah,
but I don't know the answer to that question in terms of whether it's been removed or not.
Yeah, and I think right now it's not important. I'll let you continue with your demo.
All right, so let's take a look at anything we might have going on here. Okay, so let's just look at the differences between the two. So everything above here is all just meta information that is now in our config.json file. The first function, or sorry, the first method that actually really does anything here is the add Twig extension. And that's how I was adding it in Craft 2. And in Craft 3, we do something a little bit different. So this is the equivalent thing. So here, all I'm doing is importing this class, essentially. And what we do to add a Twig extension here is we get the view from Craft app, and then the Twig variable, and then we add, we call the add extension method, and we pass in a new Twig extension, which is our class for our Twig extension. And you can see up here, here's our Twig extension class. And then we go to the actual Twig extension here. And the interesting thing is the way to load this thing in is now different. But the actual Twig extension class is, it's basically the same thing. It's pretty close to the same thing.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, It would help if I was looking at the right thing. I'm like, that doesn't look like it.
So Twig extensions are not loaded like events, like a lot of the other components in the system now. They're loaded through the view.
They are loaded through the view, and I guess it's done that way because that's just how Twig works.
Right, and I believe that Twig on its own, it has this concept of an environment, and that has to do with the way it processes things, because I mean it is a full language parser, right? It tokenizes things and it does all these things behind the scenes. So having most of the information ready to go prior to rendering any templates, it's kind of why you might have to do something, and we're not doing this in a lazy way. Like, we're not adding an extension in a lazy way. Like, you're not passing in something like can you pull up where you're adding the extension
Got it.
in the 3 version?
Yep.
So one of the things that you'll see in Craft is when you add your in this case, on line 52, you add extension and you're passing in an instance, right? And that basically means that this is where the class will actually be auto-loaded if it hasn't been auto-loaded anywhere else. But in Craft, you'll also see the pattern where you pass in something like Disqus Twig extension : class, right? And this is kind of the lazier way of doing it in Craft 3. But because Twig kind of has to have a lot of the information ahead of time to be able to know what it needs to compile, etc., you kind of have to, you basically pass in the class so it can be added to the environment, as far as I understand.
Yeah, and Ben, you make an interesting point that pretty much everything that they're doing in Craft 3 involves events. There's no real reason I can think of that they don't have an event that allows you to do this, where it would be something like, Craft view on, I don't know, Twig environment setup or something like that, and then you respond to that and then add your extension then. There's no real reason I can think of why you wouldn't want to do that. But maybe they're just assuming, well, every request is going to have some kind of a Twig environment. There's no reason to throw an event for it. Let's just add it. But this is one of those cases, honestly, where we would need Brandon to tell us from an architectural point of view why there is an event that fires that we respond to add this thing in. I guess it kind of doesn't really matter because Craft is always instantiating Twig, and it's already instantiated when our plugins are loaded. So there's no reason for an event, and we might as well just add it. I mean, that would be my guess as to why it's not working that way.
I'm almost positive that there is such event. If you really want it to do it event driven, you might be able to listen to the environment loader or something like that. If Craft doesn't provide it, I'm sure Twig has it. But yeah, I mean, I think if your plugin is going to make use of it, the init method is, yeah, I don't know if you'll be saving anything, other than you'll probably be a little more you'll be in line with the rest of the stuff. But yeah,
I think the main thing I just wanted to call out is, as we add all of these different components and types to the system, one of the new patterns we're often going to is that event structure, and this is a deviation from that.
Yeah, and I don't know why that is. And there might be an event for it. There might not. It might be just a place where they just didn't bother doing that. See, the thing about, I'm sure that Twig has some concept of events, but it doesn't know anything about the Yi events that Craft is using globally. So it would have to be some kind of an event mechanism provided by Craft 3. Like a wrapper, like after they instantiate Twig, then they would fire it from whatever component it is that instantiates Twig. So I don't think, I mean, we could listen directly to whatever events Twig is firing, but I think we might have to get the Twig environment first, and then we'd be using a different event method, and then, it'd be kind of silly. So if there is some kind of event somewhere, it would be somewhere in the Craft code.
Right.
And I just haven't looked for it,
Yeah,
I looked at what Craft itself is doing, and it's just doing this when it's adding a new one. So it's not listening to an event either.
So we're kind of getting deep into the technical aspect, but one of the things in Craft 2, there was a templates helper, and then you had the get raw function. One of those like those methods, there is some sort of checking for the encoding and checking if the environment had been loading and other things, and that kind of exists in Craft. But the idea here is that even if it was possible to define it based on an event, it'll probably not be worth it. And I think that that's why Brandon, and the whole team at PNT decided to just let's make it easy and add it in the init method or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, I guess there's no value in it. They're using events to add things whenever Craft needs to know about a global list of these things. And I think that the Twig extensions are just a case that Craft never needs to know about all of them.
Right.
Does that make sense? And I remember Brandon talking about that at one point where, yeah, we're using events to load stuff whenever Craft needs to know all of it. And it's the same with the variables, for instance. There's no event fired for that, interestingly enough, which I don't really know why that is either, but we'll get into that as well.
Yeah. How about we continue towards the next?
We just lost half of our 3 viewers now. We got 1.5 viewers left. Okay, so yeah. So what we're doing here, whereas Craft had a specific method that it called when you wanted a chance to add your Twig extensions, now I just call it in your init method and just add it, because by the time your plugin is instantiated, the Twig environment is available and we can just add it, right? And then I'm going to get to that other thing that we just discussed, where our variables class. So if we want to have variables that get inserted into the template, previously in Craft 2, all we had to do was have a variables folder and a properly named variables class, and Craft would take care of auto-instantiating this thing. Now there's a define template component method, and you can return to it whatever you want. I'm just returning the class of my Disqus variable class right here. So if we go to here, and just by convention, it's in the variables folder and it's named Disqus variable, but this could literally be anywhere and it could be named anything, which is a difference from Craft 2, where you had a variables folder and you had to have something in there with a very specific name, and Craft would auto load that for you. Well, now in Craft 3, there is this method that your plugin base class responds to, or overrides, I should say, and then it just returns whatever it wants. And you could return an array of stuff. I mean, you can return anything. And again, you're probably wondering, Ben, like, why isn't there an event that says, on template component define or something like that? I don't know. I mean, it seems like there should be.
The other question I have in this one is, if you go into the Craft app, the CMS source folder, there's no variables folder any longer. Before, you used to be able to go dig around the variables on the back end, and I don't know where to look off the top of my head for that anymore.
Well, what they're doing is they're actually instantiating all of the components that they're using, like the entry and all that kind of stuff. So you would just look in the components, and so it would be craft dot, and then any of the components that are listed there, and then you would be accessing the methods just directly on there.
We're talking
or services, or services. Yeah. Sorry.
So I have I don't know if this is a good time, but there are 3 things that maybe I can go through very quickly and add sort of my thoughts on it, because there are 2 patterns at play here, and one is hooks. The hook pattern essentially allows a piece of code to work independent from the other, while the other can latch onto a specific hook and register certain things on a runtime, right? So it's I don't know if I think people have other names for kind of like the hook-driven design, but essentially you can have class A operate, right? And then at some point during its initialization process, it will call certain methods that you can call hooks for the for the sake of this particular case. So when you call something like define template component or add extension or something like that, whatever, if it's class B or class C or whatever else, it's essentially latching or registering something onto that initial class at runtime. So this is kind of like the hook design pattern. And then you have like the event driven design pattern. Well, actually not a design pattern. I don't want to call it that because that's a whole different bag of things, but it's almost like a design that has kind of a specific name because you're essentially accomplishing a similar thing, right? You're registering something at runtime, and that's being stored somewhere. So class A working, and if it uses the hook sort of design, then class A would have methods like add extension or define template component. Other people use something like register plugin or register X, but essentially that's kind of like the hook or registration design. That class can also implement the event-driven thing where it will essentially give an opportunity. It will raise an event, right? And then class B and class C can listen for that event and then shove things into it. But the thing about it is that it's kind of accomplishing the same thing, right? And the difference to most people is that the hook should be used when you don't have to do things lazily, right? And the event should be used, event-driven should be used when you're not sure if you're going to use those things that are being registered and whatever. And I say that because Craft is still kind of doing both, and they may not be doing it for the reasons that I've explained, but it's one way to kind of wrap your head around, why do we have to register things in an event for this particular instance, and then why do we have to define a specific method that class A is going to call on my class at runtime. But as you can see in Craft, define template component, it's doing it somewhat lazily because you're not passing in an instance of Disqus variable, right? You're actually passing in a class that may not be auto-loaded right away until it's needed, or at least instantiated until it's needed.
Right, but and these are really just two different ways of accomplishing the same thing, because that easily could just be an event that you return into the event this class, and it still could be done lazily in that way. I don't know. I mean, that's something that we would just have to ask Brandon about. It could be something they just didn't refactor yet, or it could be something that there's a very good reason why it's in a method rather than an event firing.
And traditionally, I guess just to clarify, outside of Craft, other frameworks and other people that do large scale web application development or things like that, usually when you use the method definition, when you use the hook design in this case, that's most of the time that's going to happen once when class A is loaded during the construction process. You'll just call all of those methods on certain classes, whereas the events could happen at any given time, right? Like you can do something when a user logs in, but that that's on a post request. So there are some differences, but I don't want to take too much of I don't want to take too much time explaining those things. What I did wanted to say though is that since version 1, I think I've been complaining about the name variable. I think it's a terrible name. But the thing is, like right now in Craft 3, it's called template component, right? And I think that's it's not called template component. Like the method, it's defined template component. And I think that in my case, I think even in Craft 2, I started to name my classes like template API. So if I had a plugin, I would call it template API. But I just like the name variable. It's just, it can be misleading in so many ways, especially when you're trying to educate or train people. Oh man, and obviously this is just not trying to nitpick about what PNT is doing, because they're doing an amazing job. But this is one of the things that has always bugged me, like calling that one class variable rather than template component or template.
Us designers are way more comfortable with the word variable.
Well, the good news, Sullivan, is you can call this thing anything you want now.
Right.
Again, by convention, I just have it in the variables folder here.
Yeah.
But this could be called anything. This could be called template components. It could be, and this actual class could be named absolutely anything. All Craft cares about is you call this function, and you return it a class or array of classes, and it will stuff those into the component. So let's, we got about a half hour left, so let's move through a little bit more about what this plugin is actually doing here. So that's another difference in terms of how you're going to register this stuff, something that happened automatically in Craft 2 in terms of the it specifically looking for this folder variables and then a specifically named PHP class. Well, now you've got a method that gets called and you return to it whatever the heck you want. And if you're like Selvin and you hate the name variable, well, you can call it whatever you want. Doesn't matter. So real quick, we'll move on to the settings. So in Craft 2, there was a define settings function, method, whatever. God, haven't had enough coffee yet today, where you basically would return an array of the various settings and their attributes and default settings and all that kind of stuff. In Craft 2, there is just a method called create settings model. And you can see here, we're just doing something really simple where we're doing return new settings, right? And if we look up here, we're using our namespaced model called settings. And if we look at that, that's not it. That's our service. So if we look at that, this is just a craft/ye model. And all of the various things that we have in terms of settings, where we were returning them in a attribute array here, are now just properties. They're public properties on this model. But you can see everything is named the same. It's just that we're doing it differently. And we're giving the editor hints in terms of what this thing is in our doc blocks. And then you say, well, okay, how do we then do things like define what the default values are and validation and all that kind of stuff? We use a method that is in all ye models, which is rules. And we return, and we're not going to get into a huge long discussion of what all of these things are, but it's basically an array of key value, or an array of arrays that can have a whole bunch of different things to validate the data that's in there.
We do discuss that in greater detail in the last Hangout with Marion.
Yeah,
field
right.
type plugin.
Right. So basically, just real quick, discuss short name. We're saying this is a string, and it also has a default value, which is nothing. It could be something. And this one is a Boolean. This is a default value, all this kind of stuff. Roughly equivalent to what you would be doing here. The one thing that I wanted to note about this is in this model, we are defining what the default values for these things are here. So this is when this model is instantiated, it's going to be set to this, right? The validation here where we have default values, that's if something, if it is somehow passed in as being empty, or they try to set it to something it shouldn't be, it will default it to whatever you have there. And then for the, we have some other rules here that are setting like min max values, some kind of sanity checking thing. In Craft 2, you had this config.php file. And what this let people do is you could do, I forget I think it was like craft.config.get, and then you could pass in your plugin handle and then one of these names, and it would return these values to you. And what that let you do is from in a programmatic way, you could set what the default settings for these things are. And if someone wanted to, they could then they could rename this config.php file, the name of your plugin handle, and then put it into the craft config folder. And then they could then override this stuff in there, and they could do it in a multi-environment way. It was kind of weird in a way because you had your settings that you were defining in your actual plugin class. So you've got your settings here, right?
And
then
those can actually have defaults. Like they could actually have defaults back then too, right? Right here.
Yes. But then you also have your config.php, and they're kind of the same, but they're kind of separate. And one of the things that we kind of lobbied for and Brandon implemented in Craft 3 is now you'll see that there is a config.php file on the Craft 3 version, but this actually does nothing. Craft doesn't read it, doesn't look at it, doesn't do anything with it. Okay. If someone does rename this disqus.php and put it in the general PHP folder, when the settings for the plugin are loaded, Craft will override anything that is in our settings model with the values that are in that config.php file. So it kind of unifies things to an extent where now any default settings that you want to have in your model, any settings that you want accessible, you have to put them in your settings model. And the config.php stuff ends up just being a way to override the stuff that's in there via a config file. And it unifies it. And now the API has changed in terms of how you actually read that stuff in. So for instance, and we're going to get into the service, but for instance, if I want to get my plugin settings, now I just call my plugin class plugin get settings, right? And that is going to end up calling this get settings method. I'm sorry. It calls the get settings method in the base plugin class, which will end up calling create settings model, which returns the new settings. It then puts any DB values into the settings model, and then it also will override it with anything that's in the config.php if this thing has been renamed the plugin handle and put in the config general folder. Does that make sense, guys, in terms of how this kind of duality was unified for Craft 3?
I think there is no general folder, just craft config with the name of your plugin, right?
Yeah, sorry.
And
Craft config, correct.
I think the other huge benefit is because I think that the config.php was added when we started kind of lobbying for it
Right.
before Craft 3, but it wasn't really a good solution, and it didn't really support multi-environment configs. So in some of my Craft 2 plugins, if I wanted to support config file driven settings, I ended up instructing people to create an array within their general.php in whatever environment. So, but now, as you've outlined, there's the benefit of that config file being able to support multiple environments. So rather than returning a single array, you could return a multi-dimensional array that defines the environment as the key and then all of your settings.
Well, just to clarify, even in Craft 2, the config.php, if you renamed it and put it in your Craft config directory, did support multi-environments. The difference is that if Craft actually read, or you could actually read from this config.php, and if it was reading the one that was in your plugins folder, which it does by default, then it's not multi-environment aware. But if you renamed this thing and then put it into your Craft config folder, it was environmental aware even in Craft 2. But just them kind of unifying this from the point of view that you have one settings model. It's the settings, you define them in your model, they're stored in the database, and then there is also a completely optional config file that people can put in their craft config folder. And if they do need to override stuff via PHP file or so that it's multi-environment and aware, they can then do that. And Craft takes care of coalescing this all together. So now you have one settings model. You read your settings from it. You don't have this weird craft config get handle, and that there's a setting there that may or may not be in your settings model. Now you've got one settings model. It's all there. And this is a file that will let you override that.
Yeah, we would end up just using that previous config just as kind of the, I thought of it as like the draft settings area. When you're starting a plugin and you're brainstorming, just create your settings as an array and run with it. And then when you figure out what you actually want.
Yep. And this is, if you use Plugin Factory or the generator craft plugin Yeoman generator, it will generate this config.php file for you. For a Craft 3 plugin, but it notes in the comments that this file does nothing on its own. It's really just a template for people who want to create a multi-environment version of it, to rename it and copy it into their config folder. But it's, this file in a Craft 3 plugin sitting here as config.php, it's really just an appendix in a way, from the point of view that it doesn't really do anything on its own. This isn't read. You can't use the craft config get anymore. It'll throw an error. Now you do everything via this, where you can do, get settings. And if I wanted a specific setting, you can just do use SSO, right? And it's going to read in my settings model, and it's going to give me this particular value. In this case, I'm reading the whole settings in, so I can just access it, further down in there. But I think we covered everything that is different in the main plugin class. Yeah, well, okay, there's one one other minor difference. There is still a, here it's called get settings HTML. It's now just settings HTML. And we can see the difference in terms of syntax, in terms of how we will render a backend template in Craft 2 versus Craft 3. So pretty much anywhere in your code that you see Craft and then open parentheses, close parentheses, it's now Craft : actually Craft : app, right? And also some other things have been moved around here. So here we were calling the template service and telling it to render. Now there's the concept of a view, and that's what we tell to render. And it's more explicit, it's render template. But we're still passing in the template path that we want rendered, and we're still passing in our settings for what should be edited. So other than the syntax, the methodology in terms of what you use here to render your settings HTML is pretty much the same. And the template for actually doing that is going to be exactly the same. So here's our template there. And if we look, and this kind of gets back to a lot of how things were done in Craft 2 or Craft 3. On the templating level, not a ton was actually changed. There we go. So you can see, like, we're looking at these and they're almost entirely the same thing. In fact, I think they might be the exact same thing. Pretty close. Pretty close. So I think that covers, in this plugin anyway, I think that covers pretty much everything in the main plugin class that is different.
So we can start dissecting it now?
You can do whatever you want. Make it
Well,
hard. But I want to make sure we cover everything before.
Yeah, the framing of this was we were going to get into controllers and variables. I think we've touched on variables as they get pulled in here. So, and I wanted to touch on the controllers and variables because I kind of see these as the two entry points, or the two primary entry points that people kind of go from being on a website to being in the plugin. And
yeah, so let's look at, we did pretty much discuss the variables, but let's just look at them again real quick. So again, in Craft 2, there's a folder named variables, and there's a specifically named plugin handle variable file, and this gets auto-loaded and instantiated by Craft under the plugin handle. So it would be craft dot discuss dot whatever any of the functions that are in here, or methods that are in this class. In this case, there's only one. So if you wanted to access this from a template, it would be craft.discuss embed. And then you pass in whatever you want. It calls this variable function, which just ends up calling our service. So it's craft discuss output embed tag. And then over here in craft 3, it's the exact same thing. The only difference is that we have a method in our main plugin class that returns any of the variables that we want instantiated in the template. Or, sorry, Selvin, it instantiates any of the template components that we want in the template, right? And then we look at the actual variable file. And again, in craft 3, doesn't have to be named variables. This can be named anything you want, because look, we're just returning a class, right? So it could be whatever we want.
You just probably still want to name it that, because the documentation will be like that. That's the reason why I sometimes live with the naming conventions I have to, because I don't want to change anything for this, anything for the sake of it, especially if the documentation refers to it that way. So yeah.
Well, as far as I know, Pixel and Tonic is still calling them variables. So
right. Yeah.
I figured that's what they're calling it. That's what I'm going to call it.
You can name it. You're saying you can name it anything you want too. However, here you're naming it discuss variable, and they're chopping off the variable when they call it from your class name, or is
I guess they
not
are.
happening?
No. That's irrelevant, because what ends up happening is it's craft dot your plugin handle, and then dot any of the methods in this class
available that were registered as template components.
Well, no, what it does is, okay, so here.
Could I register 2 template component classes?
Yes.
You can register an array or even a string.
Yeah. How are they namespaced then? How do if I had 2 of the same methods and 2 different things I registered?
You're going to have to make sure that they're not.
Okay.
Okay. Well, you have to pass in a named array rather than just like numerical.
So you have a 4-piece variable instead of a 3-piece.
Right.
Like
but you're right that what could potentially happen is it would be possible for you to pass in the same thing. If you pass in an array of these things and you gave them both the same key, then it's not going to work. Right? They're going to be stomping on each other. I don't know what happens when you do that. But the key point here is, Ben, that when you're returning, in this case, we're just returning a class. Or if you're returning an array or whatever, what ends up happening is it's craft dot your plugin handle dot, and in this case with just one class that we're returning, all of the methods that are in this class. So the actual class name never comes into play. So this could be called my dog ate dog food, and it's not going to make a difference.
I'm curious. I'm really curious now, because relying on my knowledge about Craft 2, I know that there was no explicit like we could return whatever we wanted from that variable component or whatever.
Yep.
In Craft 3 though, is there logic to handle the type that you're passing in, because it has to handle the class name in a specific way in order to instantiate it and add it and register it, right? But if you pass in an array,
PHP callable, I think is what they're doing. I don't really know.
But the class is not a callable. It would have to be like class : something. So I'm thinking that they have to be checking for a string, I'm guessing, and then attempting to instantiate a class.
They probably do is string, is array, and then they do different things based on that. But we got 12 minutes, so let's kind of push this thing forward. So basically, we got the same thing here. And Selvin, I think what we should do is, after we present all of this stuff, let's get into the real nerd stuff afterwards. I just don't want to lose anybody before we run out of time.
I think they were lost 3 minutes into it, I think.
Yeah, you're probably right. We still got 1.5 people, though. But in any event, you can see that these are really the same. And again, this class could be named anything. This folder could be named anything. We've got one method in here called Disqus embed. Same thing over here. It takes some parameters. From your templates, it's going to be the same thing. It's going to be craft.disqus.disqusembed. Pass this stuff in here. You can see again how it's calling our service is different, same as we looked at before. Instead of craft parentheses, it's the name of, well, in this case, we're calling our service. So it's the name of the plugin. And this is just the way that I am doing things. I give my plugins a explicit class name just because I thought it was convenient and I like the way it was named. There are other ways that you can access your plugins main class. But let's get back to where, so we're saying plugin main class, plugin variable, which is the actual instance of that plugin class. Call our Disqus service with the output embed tag. Again, these things do exactly the same thing, and they look really, really similar. So let's get to our service class so that we can eventually get to our, well, you wanted to see the controller, right? Right?
Well, if you want to tie in the service, I think it's thematic.
Okay.
I don't know how much we need to say about the service, but if there's anything in there.
Okay, so the only real, arguably interesting things about the service is all this service does is it takes a bunch of parameters and it ends up outputting the embed tags that are needed for Disqus to work. And it, you know, if that's all it did, it would just be convenient because you can just say, Disqus or craft.disqus.embed output or output embed tag, and it would do it for you. But the real, the single sign-on is kind of the nice thing. So if you have it defined to do single sign-on, it will call this function that then does a whole bunch of stuff to get, the current user and all that kind of stuff, and then create the payload that Disqus wants to be sent to it to handle the single sign-on. And this is the function that actually computes all this stuff that is, this is just the ugly format that they want the SSO data to be passed down in. And once we have all the variables the way that we want them, what I end up doing, where is it? Sorry, guys. What I end up doing is calling an internal function that I have here called render plugin template. And I just pass in the variables. I realize this is cut off. Ah, I just ruined all my code. Okay. So we're passing in this variable array that we built up, and this get SSO vars just adds to this array of stuff we're passing into our template. And the render plugin template function is just kind of a helper function that I have that it sets the old template mode, sets it to be the template mode for the CP.
And template mode is telling Craft whether to render templates on the front end of the site, in the folder on the front end of the site, or in the folders of the plugin.
Yeah, and right. So this is just telling Craft, hey, render it as it's a backend template so it knows where to find this stuff. It knows the paths to look for to find the template to render. And so we're just basically passing in our variables. We have it in a try catch so that if there's some kind of a error in rendering this template, we don't just bork their whole system. We can actually return some kind of an error and log some kind of an error. And that also shows how we're logging an error. So we are doing craft : error, which ends up just calling the ye error logging stuff. And you no longer, if we looked at the craft 2 version of this stuff, it used to be that you called your plugin class and then log and then passed in like an error level. Well, now there are class methods for error, warning, trace, and info. So it'd be craft : error, craft : trace, that type of thing. And the nice thing about doing it this way, and we pass in a category, is that the debug toolbar that ye gives us will then have all of this in there. and you can sort, or you can filter just by the particular plugin, and it makes it a lot more pleasant to kind of dig through than looking at the craft.log files. And those are really, they're just kind of some syntactical differences for doing essentially the same thing. And again, similar to what we talked about the settings, the actual template that this thing ends up rendering is the exact same thing. They're in different editors, so they may look different, but this template is literally the same thing. So the templating changes themselves are very small.
That's why we're not doing any Craft 2 to 3 Twig hangouts.
Yeah, I mean, there are some very minor differences, but for the most part, it's going to end up being the same thing. So you wanted to, and that's all our service class does essentially, is it takes some variables, it computes the payload for the SSO if you're doing the single sign-on, and then it renders all of the stuff that Disqus wants in there for adding a conversation, and then it just gets loaded in and everything works really nicely. And this Disqus plugin was one of the first plugins that I ever wrote for Craft, and I didn't know what the hell I was doing. And the original one, I used like a here doc, so it would just output the raw PHP stuff, and I ended up refactoring it to actually use. It was just a case of I just didn't know what I was doing when it came to Craft. So now we leverage the fact that we have templates, and we call Twig to render the template for us, and we don't have to worry about any encoding stuff because Twig just takes care of all that nice stuff for you. So this was a case where when I was updating it for Craft 3, I said, you know what? I'm going to refactor the Craft 2 plugin to do it right, and then I'm going to port it done right to Craft 3. And if Andres or Brandon were on here, they would be able to tell me how I did stuff wrong anyway, but unfortunately we don't have them.
I thought that's what you brought me in for.
Yeah. Well, no, and we brought you in for the in-depth discussion on all this stuff. But then you want to talk about controllers.
Well, yeah, so you have this code, it gets output now, and I believe it has one controller action that can be triggered from the embed area, which is to log the user out.
The world's most boring controller. So controller is, so every controller has to have the suffix controller at the end of it. And that's kind of a Yi-ism in terms of how these things work. Let's take a look at some differences between the two of these things. One difference is that with Craft 2, the controller was camel cased, I believe. And now the controller actions are, and actually everything in the URL to trigger the controller action is now kebab case.
Including your plugin name. Including
the plugin name. So in this case, it doesn't matter because the plugin is just named Disqus, right? But if it was Disqus Awesome or something like that, in the Craft 2 version, it would be actions/Disqus uppercase or lowercase Disqus uppercase A awesome / the controller name and then the action, right? In Craft 3, instead of it being camel case like this, it's going to be kebab case, where everything is lowercase and there are dashes between the words. And I think this is mostly just getting in line with, that's the way that Yi works for all of the controller actions and all of that type of thing. So here where we've got our allow anonymous, we're using the older PHP syntax to specify an array. Craft 3 requires PHP 7, so we're just going to use our nice little brackets because they're quick and easy. And we're passing in the name of our controller action for allowing anonymous access. And in here it's camel case, and in here it's kebab case. In both cases, this is probably one of the most boring controller actions that you can think of.
But the snake case will get you a few times as you start developing with Craft 3 if you've worked a lot with Craft 2.
Can I give people a good way to differentiate between Craft 2 and Craft 3, or at least remember it?
Do it.
So
I'm ready for a poem, Selvin. Right?
no, don't
It
expect
better
a
be a
poem.
haiku. I'm going to be
So
counting the syllables too. Go.
okay, okay, all right. On line 35, and this is something behind the scenes. I talk to a lot of people that are new to craft and have like hangouts, and these are some questions that I hear a lot. So the change in how you refer to controller actions in Craft 2, it's almost like you have a one-to-one relationship between how you reference it in the front end versus what the method it's named in the controller without the action prefix, right? But the way to think about it in Craft 3 is that that mapping, while it still exists, it's really more of an alias now, because logout dash redirect, it's an ID for an action or I guess logout dash redirect is an ID for a routing mechanism that action logout redirect is supposed to resolve or serve. So it's kind of a I know it probably doesn't clarify a lot of things, but there's a clear distinction between in Craft 2, there was no concept of action IDs per se or controller action IDs. You really just follow the convention of referencing your actions like you named the action method that was supposed to handle it, right? But in Yi, like you'll see in the docs in Yi, these being referenced as controller action or controller action IDs, because at some point during Yi 2, they actually get specific routing to make sure that action logout redirect resolves. But this kebab case, it's not just like a kebab case, it's not just like a different naming convention that changed. It is, but there's meaning behind it. Now they are formal route IDs that map to controller actions. So you can be comfortable saying, why the inconsistency or whatever. So when you're referencing your actions, you're using IDs, and obviously you're going to, a URL will look something like actions slash the name of your controller slash the action ID.
Right. Well, so, yeah, it would be actions slash the name of your plugin slash the name of your controller slash the action ID.
Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Now the way I kind of try to think about it too is just that it's front end requests are kebab case. So if it's a URL, it's going to be in kebab case. On the back end, in terms of how these things are named, it's going to end up being camel case.
That's kind of right, but there are instances where you route where you can force you can run a controller action, and there are instances where you'll actually be using the ID rather than the method name.
Oh yeah, sure.
So
well, all I meant from that point of view is like, so for instance, when you're naming your functions and naming your classes and doing all kind of that coding in PHP, it's going to be a kebab case stuff. But when you're dealing with building a URL or posting to a controller or whatever, then you're going to be using kebab case.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that if I could make a recommendation to anyone that's kind of new to plugin development, you really can't understand controllers fully unless you understand routing a little bit better. So I think routing is a good place to start, and then you eventually understand that controllers are really they're really meant to respond to routes requests, whether they're get or post or whatever. But I think that
that becomes even more relevant, Selvin, when you start dealing with console requests.
Right.
Because console requests are essentially, they're controllers. They're just special controllers that are meant to respond to when I'm running things from the command line.
Right.
But they work the same way in terms of they have IDs, you know.
Right. Right.
But let's finish up. So we've got our cute little action logout redirect method here. This is our action method, and we can see over here when we wanted to log out our user, we would do this. And again, instead of craft parentheses, we use craft : app. And then there is no longer a user, well, there is a user session service, but it's called user. So I could have easily just done, oops, I could have done this, but that's going to end up invoking a magic method. So we just use this instead to return our user service. And then then the rest of it is the same. We just pass it in logout false. PHP Storm is being nice and telling us what this thing is. Should we destroy the session or not? And then we do a this redirect, the exact same thing here. The craft session service still doesn't have the concept of a referrer, as far as I know. So we're just grabbing it right from the super global and saying that we're going back to whoever sent us here. And this controller action is really just a convenience because Disqus wants to have a URL that if people click on it, they log out. So if we're doing SSO, Disqus is presenting the UI that will have the logout button. So we want, when they click it, we want to have a way to log them out of craft since we're using SSO. And that's really all this thing does. So it's pretty simple as far as controllers go, but the concepts that Selvin was talking about are really important in terms of understanding how controllers and routing works.
Andrew, you mentioned, I think this is kind of transitioning in topic from controller a little. You mentioned user triggers magic methods, get user does not.
Yeah.
I think a lot of people working with craft are interested in optimizing their code. What concepts do you need to understand behind the scenes to know what to call, to know when you're triggering other methods or not?
So it's one of those micro optimization things where there's this thing instantiated, or the craft app has this thing called the user service, right? And it exists just as this. But you can't directly access this method. It's probably a protected, this property. It's probably a protected property or whatever. So if we just did it like this, where it's just app user, this is going to work. But what's going to end up happening is it's going to end up invoking the PHP magic methods to then look up this property and return it. And we can just kind of short circuit that and say you can put get and then camel case whatever the property is, and it will directly return it. So they're accomplishing the same thing. We're just kind of skirting around using the PHP magic method. It's going to be, some tiny fraction faster if you do it this way.
So it's the magic method on the app instance.
Yes.
That says there's no user attribute here. We need to try to look or
get at. So we're going to give you an accessor to return it to you.
So this is, I recently started working. I recently started working on a lesson on magic because there was a discussion about it on Slack a little bit.
Yep.
And I hate magic, but it's so useful in so many cases. And I think even the word magic is so scary, but I think that's one of those things where a nice, concise example might be really helpful for people that are trying to wrap their head around like what's happening, because it happens in templates, right? Like there are template methods, or there's syntax in your templates where you can just call something like first, but first gets unpacked into an actual method call, and you don't have to use the parentheses, and there's a few other quirks that that you can that you should really try to understand, because once you do, you're like, oh yeah, that's no big deal. I know this is happening, and I know how to avoid it if I want to get a micro optimization.
Right.
But if you just kind of believe that it's magic, and people keep talking about magic, and the inability of, you know, us people that have been working with PHP for longer, our inability to explain it clearly kind of makes people feel like this has to be a really complex topic.
I think if you use PHP Storm, you could probably illustrate this with xdebug, right? Watching how each method gets entered in the.
So these two lines do the exact same thing.
Well,
right?
can
So
can I share my screen and just kind of give a quick a quick magic demo here?
Go for it.
Yeah.
Not really a demo. I just want to.
Do you have a top hat?
I want to write stuff out, man. I want to write some things, because this is something that I struggled with. You know, like 6 years ago, whenever I was kind of getting through the. When I was trying to dedicate fully to PHP, this was one of the things that I just didn't really know how to think about, and I think that's just.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just finish what I was saying, and you can give the presentation, because I think it'll be really useful to people. But basically, these two lines do the exact same thing. The difference is that when you invoke it this way, an extra magic method is called that ends up looking up the protected variable and then returning it to them. And so it's like another call to do it. So it's a very small optimization to not have to go through that magic method routing. So Selvin, take it away. Give us our a magic presentation.
Yeah, not a presentation. I'm just gonna try to share a couple of quick things here.
Tingling in my toes. Come on.
Oh man.
Yeah, Selvin's gonna while Selvin types, magic sparks come off of his words.
I want rabbits coming out of hats. I want a wand. I want fairy dust. Come on. Let's go.
Easy there. Easy there. No, that's not what I'm gonna do here. So what is magic, right? So magic is really just a naming convention that PHP uses, and that kind of starts with something like this, right? You have a get. You also have things like set, and you also have call, and you also have call static, right? So these are just pretty straightforward, and I think I'm gonna go a little bigger here. This is magic. There are a few others actually. There's like clone. There's quite a bit of them. But first, when we say magic, we're referring to specific method names that PHP has, and they all start with a double underscore. Right, and the reason they exist is because they allow us to do pretty interesting things. So if I have something like class foo, then I have my class, and I'm using that class, right? So I can say something like, oops, I have the microphone right on my face, and it's keeping you from watching this screen. So I can say new foo, and then I can start using foo. But what if I call bar on it, right? So what's going to happen is it's going to fail, right? Because this method does not exist on there. And you have a couple of options. One, you can just say, public function, see, and then I can say bar, and then I can say return something. I'm gonna actually hide this thing right here. Hold on. And then start typing better. Okay, there we go. So from what you can see here, this is pretty straightforward, right? We basically have a simple class, and there is a method called bar on it. So when I do this, don't mind this curly brace. This allows me to instantiate the class and then just call methods on it directly. But I'm calling bar on foo, and that resolves. I would get something back if I call it. But what happens if I want to, if there is use for it where foo is some type of API, like let's say that foo it's actually some type of API, or a really good case for magic is dependency injection or a dependency injection container. But let's say I have a API and I have bar on it, so I'm gonna rename this to API. Okay, so we're looking at an API class, and we're calling the bar method on it. So that's still pretty straightforward. But this class could potentially have hundreds of methods that are going to come from components that get loaded into it, right? So imagine you have your API, and then you're shoving things into it. So you might have, other methods. So I'm going to create an instance in this case. Okay, so now I have an instance, and I'm going to update this. Now I can do something like API, and I'm going to say get DB component. Okay, so this obviously is going to die, right? But API kind of has something in it, like maybe it's a protected thing, and it's called components. Something like that, right? And that's an array. So you can kind of think of it that way. So now I could do something like this. I could say public function call something like this. And what this is going to do is that I'm going to pass in the method and then arguments. Something like this. This is a magic method, and the way this would be used is in the event that I have a get component, or basically it's documented somewhere that I can call get component on an API class. Then I'm just gonna call it, and what will happen is that right here, method will actually be get DB component, right? Something like this. And then arguments could, in this case, will be nothing. So it'll be null. But it could be an array or whatever else. So in here, I don't have a method defined like I have bar. So what I can do is, okay, so the method, it's get DB component. And then the API has specific rules to be able to resolve or respond to that method call. And a simple way is that somewhere in here, you can sort of convert or check. You can check the name that's the method to see if you can go through your checks, and at the end you end up with something like this: DB component, right? Like you're gonna do some parsing on this, and eventually it'll give you this. So then you can do something like if array key exists or something, and inside of the let's see, transform method, this would be the transform method, and that would happen on your components. Okay, so something like this. So what's happening here is that you call this method and you expect to get something back, right? Hopefully an instance of some component. So you can do something like this. You could let the method be handled, and once the method gets called and you find it in your components, so your components theoretically will have something like this, right? DB component, and then it would have some sort of instance like new DB or something that got passed into it, or even a just DB instance. So by having that, you're essentially returning something. You from here. Okay, so now let me return this component and the method, right? So this is one way in which magic is used. And let's see here. I don't know how that stuff got there. Let me delete this line here. Okay, so assuming that this is magic because it doesn't exist, but really when a method doesn't exist, PHP tries to see if there is a underscore call, and if it is, then it just hands you off the method that was called in the arguments so that you can resolve it however. And there are patterns in place, right? So this is kind of a getter, but just by convention, you can actually remove this and know that you're going to be getting this component from somewhere. And just like this, there are other things like you know, if API, if you did something like this, right? If you did this API and you said something like get DB component, so now it's something different is going to happen. API does not define a static method. So that's when you would use something like a public function of call static, something like this, right? This is something that, and it'll be similar to this. The only difference is that you're not going to be able to use this within here. You'll have to instantiate a class, etc. But then there are other things, like what happens when it's not a method? What happens if it's just an instance of API, and you say something like DB component? Okay. So look at, if you look at these, I'm going to remove this one for now, but if you look at these two, this kind of happens in Craft a lot, right? You have get DB component, or you can do DB component, and this is what Andrew was referencing. So what happens here? Well, what happens here is that when API is called, PHP will try to find that property. So it'll see if there is a property there, but since there isn't one here, it'll take a look at something like get and then name or property or whatever. So here, by having this here, we can respond. If we don't have something like public DB component defined, and PHP is not going to find it. But since we have something here, we could find it ourselves and return it. And this is used when you have something like maybe public, or maybe you have protected, and then you have attributes, for example, and you have an array or something like this. And inside of there, you might have something like this. You actually might have something like DB component, and then that has some sort of class, right? Although in this case, I'm just going to use an array, but it could be a class. So this is a common pattern where rather than having properties in a class, you have attributes. And since we're calling a class directly, like we're trying to access a property on the API instance, and it's not defined, PHP will attempt to call get. And when get comes in, then now we can say, we check, we check if it exists. And if it does, we can just return this attributes and then pass in the name, because we already checked that it happened, or we checked that it exists. So it's pretty simple, right? This is just something that will get called in the event that it's not defined there. If it's not there though, then obviously PHP it's going to complain about it. And set is basically the same thing. So you have something like set. Oops. If you have something like set, and then you have the name, and in this case you pass value, you can pass null by default. So when will this get called? When will this get called? Well, get calls when you're trying to get a variable, then set will get called when you're trying to call a variable. So when you're trying to do something like this, equals array, right?
So Selvin, are all of these attributes created in when Craft runs events and adds all of the things to the APIs, or when they're loading the whole application?
Well, Craft, Yi and Craft both use some sort of magic, like to store components, for example. There are things like get component, but in some instances, you can also call the component directly, and it will resolve. So there is some amount of magic going on, and there are some of these patterns that I'm describing do exist in Craft and Yi, but they're not specific to either of them. This is just PHP as a whole. But there are well-established patterns, like you'll have your attributes. And if people are not familiar with like dependency injection or a dependency injection container or something, it's essentially like a single point of entry for a large app, so that all of your components, like your singletons and your multitons, classes or whatever services, they're stored in a single place. And again, this is not specific to Craft or Yi, but a lot of the times you're not going to be able to have methods for each of those, because they're going to be added at runtime. And this is where magic is useful. Like, it allows you to return or even set values for things at runtime, rather than having to predefine methods and do things like that. And this is the thing that I don't like. This is the thing that makes debugging really hard. If you understand what set and get does and what call does, like we briefly review this. If you kind of understand that, then you would be able to understand that sometimes you have something like get, and then some frameworks, I think Yi in some places does this. Okay, so name in this case is DB component, right? Something like this. This is kind of what may not be specific to Yi or Craft again, but it's a good example. So we try to use this. We had an API instance below the code, and we called DB component like this. I'm adding this just to remind us. So now DB component doesn't really exist here. Like, I'm gonna get rid of this, right? I'm going to get rid of that. And to confuse us further, I'm going to define get DB component, because this ties in to Andrew's example. So from here, I can just return, return some component like new std class or something, right? Like, this is going to be the DB component, let's say. So okay, let's quickly recap this, because I don't want to get us lost. So getDB component, if getDB component was called, we actually have a method, so that will get called directly, and we'll get the class back. But what if we call it like this? What if we just say API DB component? Well, what's going to happen is that it's going to go down the chain. First, it'll attempt to find a property inside of API, and it won't find it, so we'll call get. It'll check to see if get is defined, and in this case, it is. So we know that name is actually this DB component, right? But we already know that DB component does not exist as a property. So from here, what some frameworks, and to some extent Yi does this, it will take the name. It will check if a method named get, then whatever got passed in this case, although there will be some transformation made, and it will actually look like this. Okay, if that exists here, it will actually call it. So essentially, it will end up it'll end up calling our method, but it went through like a weird, it went through like a weird angle. But this happens a lot, right? Like, you get a name like DB component, and then you prefix it with get, and then you capitalize the first letter, and then you got your method call, and it'll end up right here essentially. But this ties in to Andrew's example, because in his example, you could do craft app user, or you could do craft app get user, right? So yeah, there are, this is magic. The property may not actually exist in app, so it'll go through the path of, all right, is there a magic get defined, and if so, it'll go through, and it could do all kinds of things here, and it could end up calling get component. It won't do that all the time. Like, it could look at its components to see if it's loaded and just return it without having to call this. But I didn't do a good job explaining what magic really is, but really, I hope that what I hope to get across is that it really isn't that complicated when you realize that you're just simply intercepting things at runtime. You might not be able to define a method to get a component that gets added at runtime, but you can intercept it if it's referenced by its name or something like that. And this is where magic it's really useful. So I'm done. Way too much time, and I probably got people more confused. But magic is not that big of a deal.
Well,
And
I got some answers for us on some of the questions. Brandon was nice enough to chime in.
okay.
So I think let's let everyone know. So yeah, where in our plugin init method we were adding our Twig extension there. Ben had the question, why aren't we responding to an event? Brandon said, yeah, the reason that there's no event is Craft never needs a global list of the Twig extensions. So the
Right.
events are fired whenever Craft needs a global list of something. So for instance, for our for things that are like all the plugins, like it needs a global list of all the plugins, for instance, so that's why there's just a function to add it. Craft never needs to know or care about how many Twig extensions you're adding. The define template component is the same thing. From the point of view is that there's only one component that you can add to, and it's added under the handle of your plugin. Now you can return a bunch of more things in there. It's the basically the way Yi does the service locator stuff, which I'm not incredibly familiar with, but you can pass in an array of stuff in there. But it's really kind of the same thing where Craft never needs to have global awareness of all of the template components that are being added. It just doesn't care. It just adds them to its config array and away it goes. And then in terms of the naming of the thing as a variable or a template component or whatever, it sounds like they're kind of up in the air in terms of what naming makes the most sense. So Selvin, if you wanted to launch your campaign, maybe now would be the time. Maybe he could be persuaded to rename that thing a template component.
I'm gonna have to be tucked into it right now. I don't think
Pick your battles. When you win one of
Yes.
them, it means your next battle is less likely to be heard.
Yeah, absolutely. I want Craft 3 to come out, and they have a lot of work to do. So I don't want to like throw blocks in the road just because I'm not comfortable with something. I think.
Well, I think this is just a naming thing, right? It's going to work the same no matter what it is. It's just
well,
what it's
Brandon also mentioned the new location of the Craft variables. There's no longer a Craft /app variables folder. It's in Craft web Twig variables, which is actually kind of saying more the variable is less specific to Craft. It's more specific to what you're doing with Twig.
Yeah, and Twig is something that so that get globals function is something that I've used and abused in some plugins before, and it basically just lets you stuff whatever you want into the Twig template as a global variable for the entire context of the Twig rendering.
Now this is referring to Brendan says that the Craft variable is instantiated in Craft web Twig extension : get globals. So when you say get globals, that's a Twig method?
Yes, it's a method on your Twig extension. And basically when it's executed and you return an array of globals that you want added to the global Twig context.
Okay, yeah, I guess we've used that.
Yeah, and you can use and abuse that for some fun stuff. So hopefully that clears up a couple of the questions that we had, and so it's almost like we had Brandon here.
Yeah.
And Selvin, to answer your question about what can be returned in define template component, it's basically anything that the Yi locator will accept.
Okay. So it uses the server's locator pattern to resolve whatever you're passing in. You
got it. So what you do is you return something that it can handle, and it just gets added to the components array in the Yi app config array.
Okay, gotcha.
And then the locator, just anything that it will take, you can return.
Sounds good.
Yeah.
Excellent. All right. Thank you, Andrew, for sharing your plugin this week and walking us through that. Another Craft 2 to Craft 3 example for everybody out there trying to make sense of this transition. Thank you, Selvin, for the magic tricks. And
I'm kind of bummed that Mother Nature decided not to allow Brandon to be here.
We'll invite him back for the next one.
I know.
All right. Well, yeah, and, we will be doing more of these. I'm going to stop saying there's going to be one every week because my own schedule doesn't always permit it, but we'll have them as we can and as we have more things to share. So we'll see you next time. Thank you for coming to the latest Straight Up Hangout. I'm Ben Friesick, Barrel Strength Design. Have a great day.
Bye-bye.
Later.